Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Will Gragel. You're watching the Deep State Chronicle. Today is February 16th, 2020. It is Sunday. Decided to take it easy today. I'm going to do one more segment with one more chapter of the Adam and Eve story. Let's begin chapter 4, the event 11,500 years ago. Did you ever sit down for an evening at a card table with a 1,000-piece puzzle by yourself? It takes hours and hours to put it together, doesn't it? With trial and error and patience, all playing their parts. We're still trying out some of the as yet unfitted pieces in our worldwide puzzle. And we've been at the table since 1949. However, even though still not complete, it shows us a graphic representation of the Earth's picture as it was 11,500 years ago. Look at a globe of the world. Pick out longitude 90 degrees west, latitude 60 degrees north. This point is in the western part of the Hudson Bay. Now hold the globe so that the spot 90 degrees west, 60 degrees north is at the North Pole. On the axis of rotation, this was the configuration of the world between 18,500 years ago and 11,500 years ago. The North Polar ice cap formed the Laurentian Basin in Canada. The continents, however, were not quite the same. There was a huge continent in the Atlantic Ocean, which stretched from England across the Atlantic to the Bahamas. The Caribbean Sea and possibly even the Gulf of Mexico did not exist yet. There is evidence of the Caribbean being land at that time. An ice cap on the globe's opposite side from the Hudson Bay covered Western Australia, and Eastern Australia was burgeoning with animals, humans, birds, vegetation, and rivers. There was another continent, Pacific, covering an area now ringed by the Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos, Easter Island, Tahiti, the Solomons, and the Caroline Islands. Have you ever noticed the heavy sedimentary stratifications making up the top half of Diamond Head? They have the same characteristics of the strata exposed in the walls of the Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, and the mysterious Canyon de Chelly. The province of Ceylon held the major civilization of India. Ayodhya in northern India was the thriving capital of that country. It was then called Ayodhya. Greece, land of the Hellenes, was the home of a tall, blue-eyed, blonde race with standards of science and law unmatched to this day. The Amazon basin was an inland sea legends call it the Sea of Zarias, and the mouth of the Amazon River was then a wide seagoing connection between the Atlantic and the Sea of Zarias. The western coast of South America was not mountainous. Indications are that the prehistoric city of Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, now at 12,500 feet above the sea level, was at sea level. It was a metropolis seaport with a canal system for seagoing ships as large as any today. Traversing from the Pacific to an inland sea, if you wish to read details about this, read The Calendar of Tiahuanaco and The Great Idol of Tiahuanaco, both by Hans Schindler Bellamy and Peter Allen. They make terrific reading. Astronomers of Tiwanaku used telescopes like ours of today, and they had a huge satellite orbiting the Earth, west to east, 449 times per year, which they used as a time standard. Its orbit was so accurate. Ayodhya, now a suburb of Lucknow, was the capital of India. And the great navigators, the great scientists, the great explorers of the Eastern Hemisphere were the dark-eyed, dark-haired Mayans. India had gravity-propelled vehicles and gravity-made weaponry. This is going into the Mahabharata, obviously. I'll have a segment actually regarding that specific mention, talking about the old aeronaut clubs from the 1800s, which has been erased from history, and some of what Dr. Stephen Greer has talked about in terms of high voltage electrogravitic propulsion. You may know it as anti-gravity. Time to smoke another. All right. About 11,500 years ago in 9,550 BC, as dated by astronomers from Potsdam Observatory, from writings in the ruins of Tiwanaku, the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth shifted its position once more in 1/4 to half a day. About 7,000 years after the previous shift, the North Pole moved southward, and the Sudan Basin in Africa shifted to the North Pole. This was the time, as the Talmud states, when the setting of the Pleiades was below the horizon occurred, and the Holy Land was moved into a region of terrible cold for many generations, actually for about 4,500 to 5,000 years until Noah's flood, about 7,000 years ago. The equatorial pivot points were off the coast of mid-Chile and in mid-China near the Yangtze, north of Vietnam. The great continent in the Pacific disappeared almost completely. What is now Eastern Island, then on the edge of the continent, dropped to remain on the Pacific Ocean floor for about 5,000 years, to be heaved up in the cataclysm causing Noah's flood. What remained of the vast Pacific continent rolled to the South Pole, to be discovered by Mayan explorers as the last remains of their motherlands, a frozen reservoir of mud at the bottom of the Earth. I believe we're talking about Antarctica here. Millions of square miles in area today, we see indications of the continent in the sedentary strata in the heights of Diamond Head and the Hawaiians, and the same stratifications in most of the higher Pacific islands. Of the great continent in the Atlantic, only a large island was left in the west, while the ocean between there and Gibraltar to the east was left shallow, muddy, and impassable to ships. A thread of a clue concerning the great knowledge of that time came out when Captain Cook discovered the Polynesian Maori tribe in New Zealand in the 1700s. They told him of ancient legends of Saturn's rings, and they hadn't even heard of telescopes. Now you try to see those rings with your naked eyes, and you'll find out that it's impossible. The evidence in Tiwanaku shows that their great civilization was wiped out so suddenly that people were caught in the middle of their normal daytime activities by a catastrophic inundation. Further evidence shows that this fabulous city suffered the same fate as Easter Island, although the Rockies and Andes were started in this cataclysm. Tiwanaku was buried under the Pacific, to remain there for almost 5,000 years, then to be heaved up to its present altitude of 12,500 feet in the last cataclysm about 7,000 years ago. So the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago saw the Hudson Bay and the opposite area just southwest of Australia both roll to the equator on opposite sides of the Earth, and the Sudan Basin roll to the North Pole. To remain there for about the next 4,500 years to 5,000 years. While this shift was occurring, taking only a fourth to half a day to complete itself, the Earth's oceans and atmosphere, through angular momentum, kept rotating in their normal direction during most of the shift, with the oceans violently inundating most of the lands of the Earth at supersonic speeds, and the atmosphere bringing unimaginable hurricanes of supersonic wind velocities. Whole continents were subjected to tremendous upheavals and earthquakes. Huge mountain ranges were created. The 60-mile thick molten layer below the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth's crust broke through the shell in places all over the world and was thereafter called Earth fire by the pitiful few who survived. Pitiful few? The whole Earth? Best estimates are less than 1% of all life on Earth. The oceans and winds took 6 days after the start of the cataclysm to resolve their holocaustic wars on the surface of the Earth, and on the seventh day began to settle down to about 5,000 years of normal activity and complacency. The 2-mile thick ice cap of the Laurentian Basin and the Indian Ocean having shifted from their polar homes and started a new course of revolving equatorially, proceeded to melt at tremendous speeds in the torrid heat, carving great grooves in the mountains as the rushing, gushing, swirling water and ice overwhelmed everything in their paths. The great amounts of moisture being poured into the atmosphere were to shroud the torrid zone in a dark fog for many years during several generations. The oceans rose some 200 to 300 feet all over the world, with the sudden melting of the ice caps, as they do after each cataclysm. The end of the Laurentian Ice Age and the start of the Old Stone Age was complete. The Mayan tongue lived on in scattered remnants. Polynesian tongues, Greek, Yakut, Egyptian, Eskimo tongues, nomadic Oriental, German, American Indian, just all about all languages. The resurrection from the waters, Tao, lived on in many stories from the Pacific of a man who survived, later to become Ta'aura, Tangora, or Taroa, depending on which tribe's legend you find. Adam and Eve could have sprung from the same story. Who knows? We're going to go ahead and conclude this chapter here. I'm going to start the next segment after this. After a short break. See you soon.